Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our August Clear Up the Chaos. I'm really excited to introduce you to some new presenters this month. I have Kevin Reynolds here, Christine Beldner, and Amanda Flynn, and they are with Ironwood Consulting. And Ironwood provides a one-source risk management solution for employers to better manage their employees, regulations. They help with OSHA, DOT. So it's just another consulting firm that we have partnered with. And as a client of NCW and Sanford and Tatum, you have complimentary access to their services as well. So if you are interested following this call and getting guidance from them, this is again complimentary. And so it's just similar to our relationship that we have with Blakeman and Associates. And there's just some paperwork that would be involved, but I welcome you to contact me for that information and I can get you set up for that. So we have a full plate of hot topics to discuss, and I'm going to turn things over to Kevin Reynolds. He is super experienced and has a lot of knowledge regarding COVID. So we're going to start that off since things continue to change at a rapid rate. Kevin, if you would speak kind of along the lines of the new CDC mask guidance and how employers should proceed at this point in time.
Absolutely. Thank you, Elizabeth. So I'm Kevin Reynolds, president of Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, I got muted there.
Sorry.
Kevin Reynolds. Kevin Reynolds. I'm president of Ironwood Business Consulting. I've got Christine Beldner. She's my vice president and senior HR consultant, and Amanda Flynn. She's our HR consultant. So we're going to kind of tag team a number of topics. But first, I wanted to talk about basically the CDC guidance, the Delta variant, and best practices for employers. We've been advising employers around the country day one in regards to what is best practice versus what are some of the unintended consequences based on the questions we may ask. So right now, obviously, we have the Delta variant that's running rapid through the country. CDC has added some guidance as of about 2 weeks ago, where they're recommending fully vaccinated people wear masks in public or in substantial or high transmission areas. CDC is recommending that to occur. They've also recommended that fully vaccinated people who have a known exposure to someone with suspected or confirmed COVID to be tested within 3 to 5 days after exposure, and to wear a mask in public indoor settings for 14 days or until they receive a negative test result. So that's probably the biggest one, is if even if you have an employee that's been exposed or been vaccinated, if there is a known exposure, they need to go get tested within 3 to 5 days after that exposure and wear a mask until they get that result back. Another thing that CDC has put out is they've basically fully vaccinated people might choose to wear a mask regardless of level of transmission. That's kind of one of their options. They're wanting to encourage it. Another one is they basically have said that indoor masking requirements are required for all teachers, staff, students, or visitors to schools, regardless of vaccination status. And if you guys fly, you'll see in the airline, they're still not releasing the fact that you're going to have to continue to wear a mask when flying or being in an airport. One of the big changes that occurred was about a week ago, President Biden came out with the mandate for all federal employees and any contractor that goes onto a site that they're going to have to do two things. Either they're going to have to be fully vaccinated, or and if they are fully vaccinated, you're going to have to attest. Right now, it doesn't look like you're having to prove. You just have to sign a form attesting that you've been vaccinated. And if you refuse to attest that you've been vaccinated, if you're going onto a federal site, then you're required to wear a mask, social distance, and go through weekly or twice weekly screening for COVID-19 test. So we get a lot of calls from our clients on basically what are my options in regards to mask, and it's kind of based on how hardcore our client wants to go. So we have some options. So one of the options is you can basically say in the business, masks are required 24/7, and social distancing is required, and temperature checks are required. So businesses we have a few businesses that have just a rampant spread where they have 20 plus positive people right now. They tend to go a little harder and just require the social distancing, the mask, kind of revert back to last year in April, May, June. We just didn't know. Another one is mask if you're unable to maintain a social distance. That's a little bit softer. What happens is if you have a mask 24/7, every once in a while you're going to get that employee that's always looking for someone that's violating the rules and not working. So in case you get one of those biddies that want to just constantly hunt other people down for not following the rule, we say, okay, if you're unable to maintain that social distance, the masking is required. Some of our clients go with no masks required if you are vaccinated. Now, this opens up Pandora's box that we're going to get into a little bit later with ADA. So some may say, hey, you don't have to wear a mask if you're fully vaccinated, but they're not asking for proof of vaccination. They're just doing the same thing at the government. We're just asking you a test that you've been vaccinated. And then the other clients will say, okay, no mask required unless fully vaccinated, but you must provide proof. That could create a medical file and again, open up problems that you don't want to deal with. So what is considered fully vaccinated? Well, if you've taken the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccine, they consider fully vaccinated 2 weeks after the second dose. If you're taking the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, that's 2 weeks after that single dose. Now, what's the problem with asking? Common question we get from our clients, what's the problem if we're even asking for the vaccination status? Well, originally before the Delta variant, people were asking so that they could inform the unvaccinated employees that, hey, you've been exposed. Now with the Delta variant and the breakthrough in the Delta variants, where there's some people that have been vaccinated, you can't necessarily make that argument that, well, I need to know so I can inform my unvaccinated employees. It's kind of out the window now. You can ask for the vaccination. We just don't recommend it as a consulting firm. Basically, with EEOC, what happens is there's the unintended consequences of when you ask, why haven't you been vaccinated, or have you been vaccinated? An employee is likely going to expose issues that we don't necessarily want. May expose that they have underlying medical conditions, may expose that they have religious belief concerns, or may expose that they're pregnant and they didn't want to necessarily expose that, inform their employee of that. So it opens up the ADA questions and concerns, which I'm going to hand that to Christine to navigate that.
So Kevin, before I let Christine go,
sure.
I did get a question. So if a company has asked already, have you been vaccinated? If they've asked their employees that and they've received responses from their employees, how do they go about documenting that information?
So it could be protected based on what they've provided, but basically that written confirmation is creating a medical file. So now that you have created a medical file on that employee, you're now required to keep that confidential, separate from the other file, and you're required to retain that data for 30 years post-employment. And that's the reason why we tend to discourage written documentation or written copies of their vaccination status, because it does create that medical file that has to be protected. It's not the end of the world, but 99% of our clients don't realize they're creating a medical file that requires retention 30 years post-employment.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. And I just want to remind everyone, you can send questions via the chat box, and I'm happy to share those with the team. So Christine, I'm going to hand things over to you.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Nice to meet you, and thank you, Elizabeth, for this opportunity, and Kevin for the handoff. We could probably spend several hours just talking about the new mask mandate. So it was challenging probably to find a good place to transition to ADA. But the reality is that we are trying to navigate now in a lot of ways the return of our workforce if we were in that telework environment, or maybe we had some hybrid of both telework and still the critical essential personnel in the office. And so there's lots of new questions that are arising as we kind of move into this next phase of the pandemic. So let's dive into that a little bit. I'm going to make a couple assumptions that, the attendees understand that ADA applies to private employers with 15 or more employees. And I'm not going to address the application to federal. I'm just going to assume that we're all private employers on the call. So at that basic level, a reasonable accommodation, I think we've all been accustomed to hearing that term, but how it's defined is those modifications and adjustments that employers make to enable their workforce with disabilities to have equal employment opportunities. So simple enough. What a lot of employers I find don't realize, though, is that the employer under ADA is required to consider that accommodation and provide it unless it poses an undue hardship. And ADA finds that undue hardship as significantly difficult or expensive. Well, they don't quantify that, but ultimately, when ADA is being applied, the EEOC looks at an expense at your overall revenue, your overall, what kind of expenses do you guys truly have, and how are you guys operating? And the EEOC really lends itself to be in favor of the employee in these situations. They're looking at you're willing to spend at least 50% or more of your actual operating expenses to cover this particular accommodation. So it's quite broad what the EEOC expects of employers. And I think that's really shocking when companies really start having to navigate that. So as we kind of dive in now, and we have that foundation of understanding reasonable accommodations and ADA, I wanted to kind of look at the top questions that we're seeing in terms of returning to the workplace and answer those questions. So question one, if a job can only be performed at the workplace, so let's look at examples of those. A good example could be your receptionist. A lot of us would say that is a job that can only be performed in the actual office space, and now it's time for that receptionist to return. However, are there reasonable accommodations for the receptionist that has a pre-existing disability prior to COVID that puts them at a higher risk for COVID-19? The EEOC actually gave guidance to this specific question, and they said that they really believe there are plenty of low-cost solutions that can be considered reasonable accommodations for employees in this category. And it's, I think, a lot of what we've already seen, the reduced contact with others. And how can we do that? It's your one-way aisles, your plexiglass, adding tables or barriers in front of that receptionist, let's say. So those are all things that we saw through the pandemic that now if that particular employee is returning to the actual workplace that has a concern of a pre-existing disability, we can put in place and consider. But the EEOC went beyond that. They think reasonable accommodations for people in this category could consider temporary job restructuring or marginal job duties. Temporary transfers to a different position, and then modifying work schedule or a shift assignment. So I wouldn't be surprised if your employees that had some pre-existing disabilities perhaps already had some accommodations in place, and now they're being requested to return to the workforce if they don't raise this concern about how truly can they be protected in the workplace. And the EEOC is going to look to employers to implement and consider those reasonable accommodations. Okay, question 2. We're still teleworking. Should we wait to conduct these reasonable accommodation requests from an employee until we actually return? Not necessarily. You know, in a lot of ways, as an employer, if you can begin those conversations and analyzing those requests now, if there's a significant change that you need to make, for example, putting up those one-way aisles or adding the plexiglass or things like that, giving yourself, the employer, plenty of time to evaluate what those accommodation requests are. I think it would only behoove the employer to start those conversations as soon as those requests are made. All right, question 3, and I only have 6, so we're nearly halfway there. An employee was receiving a reasonable accommodation prior to the pandemic and now requests an additional change to their accommodation. Absolutely begin the conversation. Don't wait. Conduct that reasonable accommodation interview. You need, as the employer, to understand if the new request is the same or related to the same disability prior to COVID, or if it's a different disability, and that's the basis for the request, to understand what change is needed, why it's needed, and then to make your determination. All right, question 4. May an employer invite employees now to ask for reasonable accommodations they may need in the future when they are permitted to return to work? So again, it's that proactive approach. You'll see this as a common theme with the EEOC, that this is uncharted territory in a lot of respects for the EEOC, for employers, and for the workforce. And so as a consulting firm, we are always going to promote have employers taking that proactive approach and being prepared. So, you know, if your employees are not reaching out and asking for reasonable accommodations, does it make sense to start the conversation as an employer? Absolutely, we would encourage it. Now would be the time. Think about, you know, what message culturally that was sent to your employees, that as an employer you do care and show concern in advance of them actually having to express a need. So again, it's a cultural decision, but one that I think we would definitely all encourage, and certainly the EEOC is looking to employers to provide that. All right, question 5. What types of undue hardship considerations may be relevant to determine if a requested accommodation poses significant expense during the COVID pandemic? So this is very interesting, how the EEOC actually responded to this. I'm going to read an actual statement from them. Prior to COVID-19 pandemic, most accommodations did not pose a significant expense when considered against an employer's overall budget and resources. So again, that was kind of what I was poorly speaking to earlier, I think. But the EEOC really does look at the requests that the employees made, and they find in most cases that the accommodation did not pose a significant expense. So really keep that in mind. They're looking at employers to really put in that money to make equal employment opportunities for their employees with disabilities. The EEOC, though, goes on to say, and I think we can relate to this, but the sudden loss of some or all of employers' income stream because of the pandemic is a relevant consideration. So we did notice several of our clients through the pandemic did fairly well with the various PPP money and the small business opportunities that existed. However, there are some companies that really did suffer. You know, the hospitality industry, for example, they really did suffer through the pandemic and lost their income stream. So the EEOC does take that into account when they're assessing whether the employers really did have an undue hardship in providing reasonable accommodation. So when you are evaluating those reasonable accommodations and you're making your determination, make sure your backup documentation is really speaking not just to that accommodation, but what the company is actually dealing with that was part of that analysis and part of that decision making. So, can you put in your documentation that we could not support this accommodation request because, loss of income, we just could not financially support it. So make sure that you're documenting those big picture factors in your determinations. And our last question, assume that prior to the pandemic, an employee had a disability and they had requested telework as a reasonable accommodation. At that time, the employer denied it because of concerns that the employee would not be able to perform their essential functions remotely. We're seeing this a lot. So employees requested to work remotely as a reasonable accommodation pre-pandemic, and the employer, we operated differently prior to pandemic. We were all really in the office, and that was just not, a fad, if you will, a trend that all of us were ready to kind of dip our toes into. But that pandemic forced that, and a lot of us found ways out of business necessity to send some of our staff or all of our staff teleworking. And now that we're asking the staff to return, is it acceptable that we expect this employee who requested that accommodation telework prior to return to the workplace? Well, what the EEOC would like employers to do in these situations is basically the employee needs to submit a new request for accommodation, requesting that telework option again, and allow the company to actually vet it. But I will say the EEOC has come out and said that if the employee was successful teleworking during the pandemic, then there's no reason to assume that the employee won't continue to be successful teleworking. So this is going to be, I think, a cultural challenge for a lot of employers, but employers need to be aware that the EEOC is going to monitor this, and the employees are definitely going to have a better leg to stand on because they've proven that they've been capable of working from home during this pandemic. So in closing, I just kind of wanted to wrap up, and of course there may be some questions, and I'll throw that to Elizabeth in a second, but I'm not sure if everyone is aware that the EEOC has a pandemic preparedness handbook in regards to ADA. It was in place long before COVID. It has been updated right after COVID. I will say though, in terms of returning for work, has one very small section. They really focus on during a pandemic, prior to a pandemic, and even the EEOC. I suspect that section about return to work is going to expand now that they're living it post-COVID. But I can send Elizabeth that link, and then she can provide it to all attendees. And then there's also a great resource in the Job Accommodation Network, or JAN. They have a section specifically discussing reasonable accommodations in COVID-19. So Elizabeth, if it's okay, I'll send you both of those links following our presentation this morning. So Elizabeth, I'll turn it, I guess I'll go to the handshake topic unless there's any questions.
I haven't gotten any questions. You're being very thorough.
Okay, well, maybe I'm too long-winded.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, well, the handshake topic. So I think, Elizabeth, you framed it, is it farewell to the handshake? Concerns amid the pandemic regarding methods of greeting. So this is a little bit of a fun topic. We get to shift from all that boring EEOC, ADA kind of stuff. So let's talk about a little bit, just for fun, the history of the handshake. So it's dated somewhere before Christ. It was a sign in the past of basically a sign that you're not holding any weapons or you're hiding any weapons in your sleeve. So men at the time would actually shake to shake out the weapon. So very interesting research having to prepare for this. But it also could demonstrate an oath or a promise or a sacred bond. We could argue some of that's still true today, but I think in American culture today, we see it as a greeting. We're expressing, gratitude. It's a sign of, completing business. I actually came across a really fun fact that President Roosevelt set the record for a head of state by shaking hands over 8,500 times at a White House event, January 1st of 1907. And I thought, wow, imagine doing that today during COVID. That would have been a super spreader event. But anyway, COVID certainly has changed our personal touch. And is that really calling a larger change? COVID has disrupted so many day-to-day things, how we went to work, how we've shopped, how we've ventured outdoors, and certainly disrupted the handshake. And, I'm not being dismissive of, the bigger, more unfortunate aspects of COVID and the impact. So while we're discussing the handshake and it seems a little silly, the reality is when COVID actually began, social scientists went to work, and this gave them the opportunity to begin conducting research that in their time wouldn't necessarily have been possible without a pandemic. I found a case.
Yourself.
I'm sorry, I heard somebody. Was there a question? Okay, moving on. So I actually found a study that began right after the pandemic started, April of 2020. 200 social scientists gathered from 67 countries and started analyzing data on the pandemic's effect on just our human interaction. And they actually gathered data from over 46,000 people 1 month into the US declaring it a pandemic. So that's pretty fascinating that some of us went right to work. It's, fascinating. Hospitality really struggled, and yet there's this whole sector of scientists and behaviorists that went to work, and I can only imagine what it was like for them. But anyway, so these are some of the arguments and areas that are being discussed by the scientists, but also socially, culturally. I think we're having a lot of these conversations. So one is shaking hands an outdated practice. There are some arguing that it's a man's practice. It's a symbol of strong men in special times and not really reminiscent of strong women. So that's one of the arguments being discussed. A second argument, which I think is very relatable, is the awkwardness of some handshakes. Some are too firm, some are too weak, some are too clammy, some are too limp, right? So it's kind of that non-verbal communication that's really speaking a lot and provides some awkwardness. So that's part of the conversation. Another argument to getting rid of the handshake is the imposition. If you think of the timing of COVID relative to the Me Too movement, there are some that are arguing that perhaps it's time that the business professionals redefine what's appropriate contact. And that even outside of the Me Too movement, there are some countries where handshakes are really frowned upon culturally. So is it time that the US and our culture really look at, not everyone wants that type of physical interaction. And then of course, with COVID, the main argument is just hygiene. What we know about COVID now and other similar viruses, is it officially time for health to put the handshake to bed? So in summary, this is a fun topic, a great conversation at dinner parties. We don't know yet, but people are definitely talking. Social scientists and behaviorists are definitely working on this and studying it. I think we've all kind of dealt with the alternatives through the pandemic. We're seeing the fist bumps, elbow taps, bowing, even smiling and nodding. So there's no answer to what companies should be doing today, but certainly we're not promoting the handshake right now. And with the Delta variant, I think it's going to be for quite a while. But I wanted to end this topic on a fun fact. There is some bipartisan support for removing of the handshake. So in my research of this topic, Dr. Fauci, he's been the medical doctor at the forefront of the pandemic, advocates obviously to end the practice. But I wasn't sure if you guys knew that President Donald Trump, self-proclaimed germaphobe, he actually wrote it in one of his books that he would like to end the handshake. So there's bipartisan support. There's definitely subcultures that support it. So I think this is just the start of the conversation, and we're looking likely at the end of the handshake is probable. So I'm sure there's hundreds of questions all about that topic, but perhaps we need to send it over to Amanda to dive into dress code questions next.
Okay, thank you, Christine, and thank you guys for having us this morning. Talking a little bit about the dress code. This is one of those topics where it seems like pre-COVID even, let's go back that far. Pre-COVID, it was one of those things that unless you had a very specific safety uniform that absolutely everyone in the company had to follow, always seemed to rear its little ugly head, every now and again, because there was always either someone pushing the line or the person that didn't want to deal with it. And just about every company I have ever talked with or worked with, this has come up at some point over the history of their career. And it's the headache. It's the headache that never stops. We have all noticed, I'm sure, just even in the course of all of our professional careers, in general, things have gotten more and more casual as the years have gone on. There's, of course, going to be exceptions to that in some particular industries. And top of mind, I most often think of like sales environments. You normally see somebody still in very professional wear. Businesses could normally rationalize it that they were asking for a specific dress code because they wanted to promote an image. They wanted people to see their employees and identify ex-employer as being a respectable, proper, well-prepared company. And so we believed, and for a long time, that would be the case, that image really is impacted by the way that our employees look. The other key thing that, as I mentioned, as a safety and health standard, dress codes would obviously apply. And we get less pushback and less questions about that because generally people understand the risks that are involved in physical environments and why you need to cover your shoes or cover your legs, things like that. And one of the real hot button questions about it, again, pre-COVID and now in the COVID world, is the impact that you hear a lot of times now about employees' productivity, or even then we hear it a lot of times now that this is filtered down into the school conversation. So learning or productivity questions, how do we learn best? How do we perform our best? So these are all things that have existed before. And historically, private at-will companies can set a dress code for their employees. Now, the caveat has always been, it can't be so onerous to either one gender versus the other. You can't require your women to still be in hose and heels and hair and makeup and just say whatever to the men. It needed to be at least somewhat comparable. And a lot of times, again, in the past, there was legislation that tended to side on the side of the employer, whether it be about ripped blue jeans or the length of a skirt, or whether hats could be worn. It used to be a lot more employer friendly. And as I think a lot of us are aware, we are hearing more and more about these specific employee cases, where it may come up as a discrimination issue or that dress code is less important. But employers do have the right to set that. But it's also important to remember that your employees have the right, of course, it's First Amendment, But really the protection there falls that they can ask questions about the dress code, that you can't retaliate against your employee because they asked a valid question about a particular policy. You can explain it, you don't have to change the policy, but you need to allow them to ask those questions to a reasonable degree. In general, in the past, now, and in the future, in our general recommendation, some of the biggest considerations for your dress code should really be the rational basis for the requirement. Why is this in our policy? Again, in the past, it was always, this is the expectation, this is the image. That more and more these days is being challenged. But as long as you had a clearly explained policy, again, it wasn't excessive, it wasn't more on one gender or the other, that it was applied consistently to all of your employees. Again, they generally supported the employer's right to place these regulations. And then obviously, it couldn't discriminate against not only sex-based practices, but either religion, ethnicity, race, some of those other issues that could tie to what your employees are coming to work in each day. So just being mindful of that. And 20 years ago, there were even court cases, Blockbuster there, Dallas-based, well, what used to be, was able to win a lawsuit where they were able to regulate how long men's hair could be. And obviously that's something that we don't see as much anymore in private companies and has tended to shift more towards the employee. You know, last year when COVID began, it's interesting to look back and see, you know, how we made light of the situation. You know, we all mostly were generally thrust into an environment, and employers were in a situation where they've never had to really regulate what their employees were wearing at home. So a lot of us last spring, last summer, if you'll remember, you know, there was constantly things on the news, or you'd see it on your feed about so-and-so showing their pajama pants in the middle of an interview because they had to stand up and walk away from their camera, and we all got a good laugh. In general, you'll find that during that period, if you didn't address specifically what you expected as your employees during that first few months, and specifically saying, here's the dress code for work from home, you were in good company. The majority of companies, that was not their focus. You know, we were all in this novel situation. We didn't know how long we would be home. Everyone is super stressed trying to find cleaning products and toilet paper. And honestly, what people were wearing was less important to most corporations. So it just wasn't the focus there at the beginning. You know, the focus was really on supporting your employees and maintaining your business during this time. But as time has gone on, you know, that topic settled down a little bit more. You know, we all got more comfortable, we got in a routine, and then you start hearing more about our spending patterns and our behaviors and how that has changed as the pandemic has gone on. With the rise of athleisure wear, I feel like if I heard athleisure, you know, one more time or had $1 for every time, I would be a millionaire. But those markets and those companies have just really exponentially grown, whereas you hear some of these more traditional clothing companies even going out of business or not being able to support their normal revenue stream. So we really started to see that shift on relaxing policies, not addressing them, not really worrying about that as much over the last year. Now, of course, it's coming back into the forefront because so many people are returning to the office. So what do we do now? What is everyone doing? If half their workforce is coming in, if they've been home for a year, what does that look like? And it shouldn't really be a surprise. You know, you have all of the same options. You can fully go back to whatever you were doing beforehand, whether that was full business casual. life just continues as normal as it was before. And there are certainly companies that are doing that. I would suggest that in general, if you are not sure which direction to go with this, or have, again, a real business or safety reason to go one way or the other, a lot of times you're seeing in the HR community, the call to really readdress and look at your dress code policy. If you haven't looked at it in a while, if it's been that way forever, and now we're going back into the office, looking at the language and going stipulation by stipulation, and why is that there? What business purpose does this serve? Is it necessary? And is it going to really further our employees or our business needs? And I think that you'll find that the swing has been years ago where you had these really detailed policies. I can remember making PowerPoints with examples of what was acceptable dress code and what wasn't acceptable dress code, to a much more general policy. Stating that you should be in business attire. And then there might be a few things that you specifically prohibit, or you put in a stipulation that it has to be with managerial approval, so that you have some onus over the situation. But in general, these are shifting to a lot more general blanket policies. And this may be the way to go, especially if you're the type of company where you are going to have some people in the office, you're going to have some people working from home. Again, staying general, going with the philosophy that less is more. And when you start to get really specific, now, again, that can tie into some of your discrimination issues that you need to worry about when you're really coming down to each and every article of clothing and who should wear it and exactly what that should look like. Shifting that direction to, instead of specifically saying one gender or the other, you're just saying employees are expected to dress in this certain way. And then you're pleasing everyone. It's maybe not a huge cultural shift for your organization. It's just been this minor change to policy that has evolved with time. And you want to make sure that those rules are written for all of your employees, that it's general, it can affect everyone in the same way, again, without putting onerous too much on one gender or the other, or one group or the other. And then really focusing on, if there is a policy violation, if you're going to speak to that employee, what specifically are you addressing? And again, what is the root cause behind it? What is the motivation? So you can fully go back to what you were doing before. You have companies that are going 180 degrees in the opposite direction, and they're going fully casual all the time. They have found that their teams were just as productive at home. There was some crazy statistic, like 1 in 7 people admitted to not wearing pants while working during the last year, like some ridiculous scenario where maybe oversharing too much flexible information. But people really have gotten used to that. Roll out of bed, get on the computer and start their day. And especially if they weren't client facing or forward facing, that they could do that, in their pajamas if they so choose. So there are companies that are coming back and saying, okay, you can't come to work in pajamas, but you can come pretty casually. The rise of the joggers, which are just sweatpants, but now suddenly okay, and leggings in the workplace. They're embracing that as long as employees are getting their job done. That's really been the focus. So you're seeing both directions, and then a few organizations have actually been trying a more hybrid approach. Maybe you can dress down where it used to just be casual Friday, maybe it's 2 or 3 days a week. Thing I thought was interesting to think about that I hadn't read about until looking at information again this week, that some companies have told their employees, especially as they came back into the office this summer, okay, until the fall, we're going to be casual. Let's get everybody back to work, get your kids back to school. Don't focus on this yet, but so that this is coming. That's going to be really interesting. I think it's an interesting idea to try to give that flexibility, but especially because in general, I don't think most people were expecting the step backwards we seem to have taken as far as the number of cases. It's going to be interesting to see where that goes and whether they're going to have to pull back from that or just stay with flexible with their timelines. But one of the biggest questions we get, and I feel like if you're just in general researching the articles, the thing that comes up the most about dress code is the employee's productivity. And this has been honestly kind of a pet project for me for going on 15 years. So anytime I see an article about this, it's one that I always devour because it's really interesting. And in general, I can tell you as honestly as I have read, you can find a case both ways. For as many articles that you can pull that say that employees are more productive when they are in business attire, there is almost always a reverse of that, saying they're more creative, they're engaging better with people because people are casual and connecting on that level. And it really is going to boil down to what is right for your business, your culture, what is right for your employees, and looking again at that, core policy. Why are we saying this? What is our goal? What is our motivation? And addressing productivity and issues, as they come up, separate from dress code. If that's additionally an issue, then of course you're going to address it. But productivity can also be just a separate issue that hasn't been addressed. Another question you see a lot with the more casual dress code is what onus this would put on managers. Are they going to have to run around and be the dress code police every day? Especially if you shift to a more general policy. And that could be a situation at the very beginning. If this is a real big change for you to go to a full casual or full flexible environment. But I think that as long as you are maintaining those open lines of communication, you're going to see that a lot of that is going to die down after the very initial newness of the situation. People are going to know what the expectations are and go from there. And then the last thing that we've kind of already touched on when we touched on masks this morning is just really factoring in when you're making this decision on what to do now and coming back from COVID, is kind of thinking about what you are asking of your employees today. Because even if you are back in the office, what PPE are you having your employees wear? What sort of extra cleaning or expectations are you having on your employee? And is the dress code really the issue you want to push right now? Or are they working with chemicals that you've never had your employees have to bleach down the copy machine in between uses before? It used to be janitorial crew did it and now at night, and now we're either doing it throughout the day or after each use. There are some environments, it's less now that cleaning supplies are more available, but especially last year, we saw that question a lot about if they get bleach on their clothing and they don't want to smell like chemicals all day long. But kind of keeping those things in mind. Again, whether you decide to go with two separate policies from work from home or business, whether you go back to full business wear or whether you go fully flexible, again, it's just a really good time to look at that policy and see what makes sense now. What is making sense for the environment that we're in, not only with COVID, but in the future. And you also have the option you're seeing too for that work from home specific group that you might have your general dress code, but maybe in your telecommute policy or your telecommute agreement, there's some really specific make sure your business present for the camera when those meetings occur. But you've got a lot of choices. It can be overwhelming because there doesn't seem to be one exact clear answer we can point you to. But in general, we want you to be inclusive of everyone, more general more general instead of really specific so that you don't face any sort of discrimination issues, and really just what makes business sense. Have that justification behind the scenes of why this decision was made, why it was applied in your situation, and that it was done equally. So that is a lot of information about dress code. Elizabeth, do we have any questions? Do we want to touch on recruiting? Where do you want to go from here?
So I do have a few questions. So Kevin, I think this is going to go for you. With the rising number of cases that we are seeing, do you suggest that employers readdress their expectations regarding if they're going to pay employees who are in quarantined when they've been exposed to COVID?
Yes, so good question, actually. And just to remind people, unfortunately, I find probably 50% of the people we speak to about this don't realize that they get reimbursed by the government for this COVID PTO. Now, as of January of this year, choosing to pay the employees COVID PTO is optional for employers. You're not required to do that like you were last year. Now, that was from January 1st to March 31st. And then the new Biden stimulus package extended that from March 31st to September 30th. Still optional for employers, but prior to March 31st, employees were only allowed one time for COVID PTO. So we had a number of people that faked COVID to get that pay back in April and May, and then all of a sudden they ended up getting it and they couldn't get it twice. Well, as of March 31st, now they can get it again. So if you are going to do it, then you need to mark that COVID PTO separate so that you can get reimbursed off your Social Security portion of your payroll taxes, and your CPA or payroll company can help you do that. Then follow the guidelines for, we can send a poster to you, Elizabeth, if you guys haven't shared that poster in the past, of all the different reasons that can trigger COVID PTO. Basically, if the person has been put into quarantine, if a person is going and getting testing, if they're been told by a doctor to quarantine, even though there's not a positive test result that accompanies it, they can get up to 80 hours of PTO, up to X dollars per week at 100% of their pay rate. If they're taking care of someone that has COVID and it's immediate family member and it's expected they take care of them, they can get 2/3 pay rate at up to 80 hours. And then if the employer is over 50 employees, there could be a family medical leave option that they could get up to 12 weeks at 2/3 pay rate. If you find yourself in that situation, the best thing to do is don't try to navigate that, just reach out to us. That's why we're here. That's why the relationship exists with NCW.
Christine is just on the ball. She just keeps sending all these things. So in the chat box, everyone, she has shared several different links, and I will go ahead and share those as well in the follow-up email that I send. But if you're interested in looking at those this morning, she has shared those, and she's also, it looks like, shared a Department of Labor poster as well. So Amanda, I know our last topic was just the tough market for recruiting employees. I would like to let all of our clients know that we are doing a seminar in September, the end of September. Nothing has gone out yet, but y'all will be the first to know since you're our Clear Up the Chaos attendees. September 23rd, I believe is the date, save the date. We are doing a seminar on how to retain, recruit, employees in this tough market. And I think it's going to be really great. Everyone here is, I think, going to be assisting either behind the scenes or day of. So I think it's going to be really beneficial because I know it's really hard right now to get people wanting to work with all the free money that has been being shared. So yes, look at Christine. She's just on the ball. I love it. Yes, how to recruit, hire, and retain high caliber employees, September 23rd. So mark your calendars for that. And then, of course, I'll be, I'm sure, blowing up your email with save the date information and links for you to go ahead and sign up and share with your organization. But more to come on that topic for sure. I'm going to open it up if anyone has any other questions while we have everyone still here together. We welcome those questions. And as a friendly reminder, Clear Up the Chaos does take place the second Tuesday of every month at 10 a.m. So I hope by now it's on many of your calendars as a reoccurring event. The next Clear Up the Chaos is taking place September 14th. So we would love to have you joining us for that. And if you do have any questions that you find yourself struggling with, or if you think would be valuable for us to address, please send those to me. I would love to add those to our hot topic lists. Or if you need an answer right away, I'm happy to reach out to these lovely individuals and get an answer for you immediately. As a Sanford and Tatum and NCW client, you do have access complimentary to Ironwood and these individuals here and their expertise. So I do encourage you, if things come up and if you're in a challenging place, please reach out to myself and I would be happy to get you the paperwork. It's very short. It's a one-pager, one signature, really quick and easy. So I welcome you to reach out to me and utilize these free services that we have to make your jobs easier. So thank you all so much for joining us, and I will be sending out the recording if you'd like to share it with anyone in your organization. And Kevin, Christine, and Amanda, we so appreciate your time and knowledge, and look forward to having y'all on again soon.
Thank you
so
guys.
much. Have a great day. Bye.
You too.
Thank you, guys.